All right, y'all ready to roll? All right, let's do it. So, a couple of things that I'm going to say in the beginning of this. So we're going to be talking about philosophical concepts that have influenced or kind of come out of Christianity. Some sense there's some overlap between the two. So if you study the topic of theology, it is impossible for you not to find yourself in the topic of philosophy. In fact, it would be very helpful if you were going into theology to have a degree in philosophy, because that's going to give you the underpinning for the thoughts that are going to branch out in theology. So I wish somebody would have shared that with me beforehand. Criminal justice hasn't really been helping me a whole lot. I keep thinking it will come in handy at some point. Like somebody's going to need to be arrested here, right? Like it's a rowdy crowd. But so there's some overlap in here. What I've done is I've taken 4 kind of interesting philosophical ideas or concepts, and I'm going to share them with you this morning. I'll probably share 4 with you next Sunday as well. Then we'll unpack, problems with the idea or really good things about the idea, and really, but how that bleeds into Christianity. And a lot of these, there's not going to be a lot of unpacking of that, because you're going to see it pretty easily. And some of these will actually come out of Christianity. So I don't know how much philosophy you read. If you read modern philosophy, it is generally isolated from Christianity in some regard. But when you're looking at philosophy that's coming out of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, a lot of that is completely embedded in Christianity, because there was a faith that was already present in the philosopher, or at least in the community in which he is doing his work. That's not necessarily the case today. So you'll see that a lot of these are, just clearly Christian. So before I get into that, though, Happy Mother's Day to you all, to the mothers out there. We will, what's that?
Thank you.
You're welcome, Kendra. But we'll celebrate this more appropriately in the actual service today. But Happy Mother's Day. So, a couple things. These are individual ideas. They're not necessarily connected. They're just ideas that I wanted to present to you. And the first idea I want to present to you is Pascal's wager. And I'm going to ask you this on every one of these, just so I know who to ask. Is anybody familiar with this idea? All right. So Pascal's wager, is anybody familiar with Pascal? Blaise Pascal? Okay. So Pascal's wager is pretty interesting, but I'm going to give you a little bit about him. He's a 17th century French mathematician and philosopher, and he has a bit of a gambling problem. He likes to gamble, and a lot of his work is going to come from his love of gambling. And he is actually considered the father of probability, let me get the exact term, probability theory. He is the father of probability theory, and you can understand why. He's gambling. He wants to figure out what's a good bet and what's not a good bet. And so he's a mathematician, he's a philosopher, but later on he's going to become a Christian. When he becomes a Christian, he's going to stop gambling. Now, I don't necessarily think that you have to stop gambling to be a Christian, but in the 17th century, it probably was very much frowned upon, and if you were going to be a Christian, then you would have to stop gambling. But his work is still going to be produced from this idea. So, what's the wager? It's pretty interesting. So, Pascal's going to say when deciding whether or not to believe in God, it's like a gamble. And so he's bringing forward the idea of belief in God, and he's saying that you could look at it, you don't have to, but you could look at it as a gamble. And there are, some people might think that this is weird, but there are people who do this today. So when I get to the end of it, I'll show you people who do this today. It's like a gamble, it's a bet, but he's asking the question, is it a good bet or is it a bad bet? Is it a good bet to bet on God, or is it a bad bet? What's your thoughts? Good bet. Good bet? Anybody want to go bad bet? Okay. All right. So for Pascal, the answer to that question comes down to the consequences of the bet. And I have tried to instill this in my kids quite a bit. Consequences of the bet matter immensely. And because my kids will come to me and they'll say, let's make a bet. If I do this, I get this. Okay. What do I get? Nothing. I'm like, well, the consequences of the bet do not warrant that I'm going to make the bet. But if you were to, give me something, then I might be open to making the bet. The consequences of the bet matter. Pascal's he's going to put everything on the consequences of the bet. And so what he's going to say, here are the consequences. He's going to say, if God exists, the consequences of believing is eternal life for believers and hell for others. Okay? If God does not exist, the consequences of believing in Him is at worst living a religiously correct life without need. So essentially, there are minimal consequences to betting on God, while the consequences of betting against God are awful. Take the smart bet. That's from a philosopher, Pascal's wager. It's well known. What are the problems with this?
You never know. You don't have an answer.
Well, you don't have an answer until the end.
Yeah. Nobody else. You're not.
You don't have an answer until you need an answer.
It's not true belief.
There you go.
There's no faith required.
There you go. This is completely dead. This is just like, just in case, and I refer to this as fire insurance all the time. I don't want to go to hell, so just in case there is a God, I'm going to attend church. But there's no life in it. There's nothing that's lively about that faith. It's just, this is probably the smartest bet to make. Therefore, I'm going to make the bet. And I'm going to live a religious life just in the chance that there is a God. But the problem with this is it's dead. It's dead faith. And do you think that God knows that it's dead faith? Do you think God's just like, well, it's faith, I guess, It's not really faith. It's just, again, it's like insurance. So that's Pascal's wager, and it's a very interesting idea. I like it, Jack.
I had always heard this summarized as, if you don't believe in God, you better be right.
Yeah. Yeah. So like another way that people talk about this is that the burden of the argument of does God exist is on the atheist, because you're going to have to prove that God doesn't exist, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. And so even if you were in a room of atheists, you could say that's a very, very difficult thing to do. Whereas to a belief in God, you don't have to be right about Jesus. You just have to be right about God, that God exists. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at it, but I just think Pascal's wager is kind of interesting just from a Christian point of view, because what it reveals is a faith that we don't necessarily want. But it is a cool idea. All right, so if you move on from there, you get to Paley's Watchmaker. And this is probably, I'm not going to say it till the end, but is anybody familiar with Paley's watch? Nobody's familiar with Paley's watch? All right. So,
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Statement.
yep.
You said you have to believe in God, but you don't necessarily have to believe in Jesus Christ.
No, I'm saying if you're making the bet on God's existence as opposed to God doesn't exist, that's not the bet for Christians.
Oh, I know, but that sounded strange.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification. So nobody's heard of Paley's watch. All right, so I'll paint the scene for you because Paley is going to give it to you in an image. But before I do that, I'm going to share a little bit about Paley with you. William Paley is an 18th century philosopher, Christian apologist, and Anglican priest. So he is all three of those things. His focus is on natural theology. Does anybody know what natural theology is? Natural theology is the idea that you can look out at the world around you and you can see a God exist. You don't need Jesus, or you don't need the Bible, or you don't need a church to tell you that God exists. You can look out at the world around you and acknowledge that God exists. Now, I don't go along with natural theology, or I don't think natural theology is sufficient, but he focuses on natural theology and intelligent design arguments. He's one of the early intelligent design arguers for how the world came about.
How did he get ordained as a priest in a Christian denomination if he was a natural theologist?
He's not a natural theologist. I'm not saying that this is enough for him, but what I am saying is that that's his focus in philosophy. His focus in philosophy is on natural theology. He certainly believes in Jesus. He certainly believes in all the stuff that you and I believe in. But where his interests lie is in natural theology, looking out at the world and saying, okay, you can look out at the world and see that a God exists. And so Paley claimed that the regular movements of the solar system resemble the workings of a giant clock. So he's looking out at the solar system and he's looking at how things move and tick, and this is moving, and when this moves, it's moving this over here, and when this shifts, then this is shifting up here, and he's looking at it and he's saying it's kind of like a clock or a watch where all this is working together. Like these are not isolated things, like this is over here and this is over here and they don't interact. There's an interaction in the solar system that one thing is tripping off another thing that is setting another thing in motion, and it's kind of like the workings that you find in a clock or a watch. Does that make sense? So he's going to give you this story, and he's going to say, let's just say that you're walking along on the beach and you come along this watch that you find on the beach. Maybe you're digging in the sand, you find this watch on the beach, and now you have this watch in your hand. The immediate assumption that you're going to make is that there had to have been a watchmaker. that somebody made this watch. You wouldn't assume that the tide, over thousands and thousands of years of pounding on this stuff, created this watch, because it's so intricate. It's so, everything is working together. This is setting this in motion to move this, to make this happen, that there had to have been initially a watchmaker. And so and then he's going to take that idea and he's going to say, if you take that idea and you apply it to the universe, which is infinitely more complex than this watch that I'm holding, when you look out at the universe, you would have to conclude that there was a universe maker, that something created the universe. And so this is his story. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. There had to be a divine creator, because the universe is so complex that it would not have evolved in such a way. So that's Paley's watch. Thoughts on that? Do you like it?
Yeah, I do. Sure.
Is it conclusive? Is it solid?
Yeah, it's just not faith-filled.
Well, again, I mean, he's looking out, he's studying natural theology, so he's looking out at the universe and he's trying to say, does the universe speak of God's existence? And so, and you can do this in a variety of ways. People go down to the beach. Why do they go down to the beach? For like, some people go down to the beach on like Sunday mornings, and they'll walk the beach and they're taking in the beauty of the world that was created. You can see creativity in the world, and you can just look at like a hippopotamus and see like this amazing creativity and all the variety of animals. And you can take those ideas and you can apply them to God. And so based on all the animals that God has created, like a platypus, you can say that God is creative. You can say that God values beauty. You can say that God values order, that God is structured. And part of what it means to be a human being is that we are created in God's image. We are those things as well. Some of us are more creative than other people. Some of us are more structured than other people. But still, we have those attributes of God. And you can see those attributes of God in the world that we live in. Without opening the Bible, without attending church, without speaking of Jesus at all, you can just look at the world and say, something created the world. And that's what Paley is doing. He's not discounting Jesus or the Bible or church, but he's just making the argument that even if you didn't want that, even if you didn't want any of that stuff, you could see a God that exists just by looking at animals, trees, a sunset, all of that. So, historically, Paley's watch is not particularly a good argument. And it's been attacked quite a bit. Yeah.
It's still a good basis to start with an atheist.
Yeah.
Who I would say, okay, what do you think about this thought? Because surely they're not that dumb to not consider this idea.
I think that it does have its place, and this is used in apologetics. So another thing that Paley was interested in, he's a Christian apologist, meaning that he's a Christian who is arguing for God's existence and belief in God. And so this is used in apologetics quite a bit, which apologetics is a reason for the faith that you have. It's arguments for the existence of God. It does have a place. It's not conclusive proof. It's going to get attacked for being overly simplistic. What the main thing that it's going to get attacked on is that we know watches are produced by watchmakers, so we're not making any giant leaps there. But David Hume, another philosopher, pointed out that we have no idea what sorts of things create universes. That actually requires a leap. And so it does get attacked quite a bit as being overly simplistic. But I do think, the idea of it is pretty cool, and I like it. I personally like it. Is it going to win you the argument? Probably not. But it is another thing that you can use in talking to people who do not believe. So that's Paley's watch. Now, the other two are a little more complex. This is Kierkegaard's Leap of Faith, which is this is my favorite philosopher of all philosophers. I absolutely love Kierkegaard. My youngest son, his middle name is Soren. In fact, he goes by Soren at school. When I go and pick him up, if I ask for Luke, they look at me like, we don't have a Luke. So he has two identities, really. But I named him after Soren Kierkegaard. I absolutely love him. And his idea of a leap of faith. Anybody familiar with that? You're familiar with the phrase, right? The phrase comes from Soren Kierkegaard. And we misuse the phrase all the time. What we call a leap of faith is not what Soren Kierkegaard meant by a leap of faith. So I'm going to walk you through Soren Kierkegaard first and then his leap of faith. So he's a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian. So he is a Christian, but he doesn't always like being a Christian. He doesn't always like anything. He's kind of a grumpy, sad individual. I love his writings. I would not want to be him. He's one of those individuals that is burdened throughout his entire life. He struggles immensely. So he's widely considered the first existentialist philosopher. Existentialist philosophy is pretty popular today, but it wasn't necessarily during his time. And much of his writing is done within a Christian lens. Sometimes it's a positive lens, sometimes it's a negative lens, but it is always an honest lens. So he wrote a book called Attack Upon Christendom, where he just absolutely annihilates the church. And I would highly commend the book to you. It is every place where the church should have been attacked, he attacked it. And I love that. Anybody who is willing to attack the church from inside the church, I'm all about that. Don't attack me from outside the church, though. It's really, his writings are really interesting because he is a Christian, but he also struggles immensely with being a Christian and with the church. And I'm sure you're familiar with people who have had that position. People who say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, I love Jesus, but I want nothing to do with organized religion or the church. So that's kind of Soren Kierkegaard. So, okay, the leap. This is really cool. I absolutely love this. So it's a state in which a person is faced with a choice that cannot be justified rationally. He therefore has to leap into it. So you have a choice before you, and you're going to choose this thing, but you cannot rationalize choosing that thing. And so what you have to do is you have to leap into it. Anybody familiar with taking medicine? Yeah? How do you take your medicine? If it's liquid, do you sip it? Nobody sips it, right? You just got to take it down, right? Because you can't imagine just sitting there sipping it, right? You're going to have to just do it. And this is what Soren Kierkegaard is putting up there. You have this choice, and what you're choosing is so irrational that you have to just leap and do it at that moment. Otherwise, you would never do it because you can't rationalize it away. You can't come up with a reason why you should do it. This is, for Soren Kierkegaard, this is where faith and rationality and reason collide. He's saying that you have to make a leap of faith in that moment, otherwise you won't do it. This bleeds into my idea of baptism. And this is one of the reasons why I think that we should be baptizing people and baptizing people immediately. Because being a Christian is not rational. You might try and make it rational, but it's not. The idea that Jesus died on a cross and his blood somehow covers your blood, and then all of a sudden he rose again, even though we know that no one comes back from the dead, but he did, and only a couple people, group of people saw him, and then he floated up into heaven, which today is Ascension Day, by the way, while the disciples watched him float up into heaven, and then he's going to come back. None of this is rational. It's not. The problem with Christianity, modern day Christianity, is that we try to make it rational. We try to say, yeah, it's rational. It's not. It is always meant to be a leap of faith. It is always meant to be this moment that you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. So Soren Kierkegaard's idea of a leap of faith is that you have to do it, otherwise you would never do it, so you just leap right into it. It's making a decision in the very moment of madness. That's how he describes it. That's how Soren Kierkegaard describes it, as making a decision in the moment of madness. Not sitting down, writing, pros and cons. In the moment of madness, you make the decision for Jesus. You make that leap. Doesn't have to be Jesus. It can be any decision. But that's how he describes it. It's a gamble. So what's his idea of faith? And this is fascinating to me, because it's going to say belief or faith is belief in the impossible, irrational, and paradoxical. What I just described to you, the core of Christianity, that God came into the world, that God died on a cross, that God rose again, that God ascended, and that God's coming back, is the very definition of impossible, irrational, and paradoxical, unless you have encountered this other times. Anybody else? Anybody encounter this before? So that what Soren Kierkegaard is saying is faith is that, and if you're making a leap of faith, then you are jumping into, in the moment of madness, to ascribe to something that is impossible, irrational, and paradoxical. And he's going to go on. He's going to say the ultimate example of this is Abraham and Isaac. And he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. I commend it to you. It's not an easy read, but none of his writing is easy. But he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. It's a fantastic book. And the reason he wrote it is because he struggled with this story immensely. How could God call a human being to sacrifice his only son? And I'm sure that that's probably a struggle that at least most of you have had in here. And so he's writing this book trying to wrestle with this concept. And this is where he lands. Abraham has to perform a leap of faith and obey God, but still maintain the belief that Isaac would live. So he's doing both of these at the same time. He is making the leap to sacrifice his son. He goes on that trip. He takes his son. He doesn't tell Sarah. You remember the story? He doesn't even tell Sarah because he knows. If he tells Sarah, he's never getting out the door. And so he just takes Isaac and he's taking him to sacrifice him. And he really is planned, to follow through. And at the same time, he has the belief that Isaac would live. that is impossible, irrational, and paradoxical. It's the leap of faith that he's making. I have to obey God, and my son will live. Well, it doesn't make sense, right? And that's why, for Soren Kierkegaard, he says that Abraham just left. Just grabbed Isaac and just left. Because he had to do it in that moment, otherwise he would never do it. In the moment of madness, he made the decision and he went. So, it's impossible and irrational. No, it's just a leap of faith. And this is Soren Kierkegaard's idea of a leap of faith. Now, you generally hear people say, well, I just made a leap of faith and I paid that bill. Or I just made a leap of faith and showed up and was hoping you were here. Like, that is not what Soren Kierkegaard had in mind when he's talking about a leap of. He's talking about grander things, like a real leap of faith that is really going to put you out. So that's the leap of faith. Any thoughts, questions on that? Is it cool? It's kind of cool. I love it. Again, that book, Fear and Trembling, fantastic book. All right, the last one is pretty fun. This is John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. What's that?
Utilitarian.
Thank you. Utilitarianism. So this is a concept that you're all familiar with. And I'll unpack the concept, but first I'm going to tell you about John Stuart Mill. 19th century English philosopher and politician. Probably not the best picture, but, or at least I hope not. He's widely considered to be the first, one of the first male feminists, as well as an early abolitionist. He is fighting for the people on the fringes at that time. But he's probably most known as a proponent of the ethical theory of utilitarianism, which I have a hard time saying. All right, so utilitarianism is basically, a lot of people live their life through this lens. And some people will attack it. But it's that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness or pleasure. And by extension, actions are wrong to the extent that they produce unhappiness or pain. So this is the pain and pleasure kind of concept, that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain. Whatever we do in our life, often or most of the time, it is geared towards the concept of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And so he's putting out there that actions that seek pleasure and avoid pain are generally the right actions, and actions that produce pain and not pleasure are the wrong actions. So in ethical decisions, the right path is the path that produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Following with that? So whatever produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that is the right action. There are all kinds of problems with this. And so we'll go through a lot of the problems, but there is some merit to it. It's just that this can be abused on so many levels and has been abused on so many levels. So the problems with this idea is that it can easily be used to support things like tyranny, torture, and mob rule. So because it is generally what the majority want, whatever makes the majority happy, that must be the best decision. So if the majority in here wants something, and that's going to make you happy, well then we can do that because it makes the most people happy. So that's a problem. In addition to that, it doesn't take into account anything but happiness or pleasure in ethical decisions. It does not take into account the greater good in any regard. It just takes into account, well, does it make you happy? Well, if it makes you happy, then it must be like the greater good. And if more people in here are happy about something, then it's the greater good for the group because it makes you happy. When in ethical decisions, I mean, a lot more is being factored in rather than just happiness. We have to factor in a lot more. Now, there are segments of this theory that do account for these things. So it's an umbrella term in which there's a variety of branches that do try to account for these, but in general, this has been the problem with it. In addition to that, it does not address certain kinds of pleasure as better than others. So for example, like the pleasure or the joy of helping somebody who is truly in need, as opposed to the joy and pleasure of eating ice cream. Like those are two radically different pleasures, and they bring about radically different joy, and they should be accounted for, but it doesn't necessarily take into account the different levels of pleasure. In addition to that, it doesn't address the level of happiness in regard to the level of unhappiness. So let's just take an example here. In this group, let's say the vast majority of this group wants peanut butter cookies next week. Okay? And there's only 3 people in here who do not want peanut butter cookies. They would prefer chocolate chip cookies. But because the vast majority want peanut butter cookies, we're going to have peanut butter cookies because that's the greater good, right? But this doesn't take into account that those 3 people that do not want peanut butter cookies actually have a peanut allergy and will have no cookies. Whereas the people who preferred peanut cookies or peanut butter cookies, they could eat chocolate chip cookies. They just prefer peanut butter cookies. Do you see the difference? Like the unhappiness far outweighs the happiness of the larger group. So you can't just go by the total number of people. But there's a better example of this that is has been talked about in philosophical circles quite a bit, and it is the trolley problem. Are you familiar with the trolley problem? All right, so I'm going to show you the trolley problem. I actually have a picture of it, so it's pretty cool. Here is the trolley problem. So there's a runaway trolley, and it's coming down the tracks. And it is coming to hit these people who are tied to the tracks. But you have the choice to pull a lever which would shift the trolley off of here and just run over this individual. Would you do it? Would you pull the lever? Now, presumably, this isn't your family. These are strangers and this is a stranger. Would you pull the lever? Because this is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Only one person's going to get run over here. Whereas here, you've got 5 of them. So this is the idea in an image. Would you pull the lever? Come on, almost like 90% of people will pull that sucker. What's that?
What if those 5 people were like prisoners? They killed other people.
You're just like my kids. You're like, whenever I used to, I always give this analogy, but whenever I did youth ministry, I always had to give like the sex talk in youth ministry. And so I would give the sex talk, and at the end of it, I'd always have one kid that was like, well, what if it's the end of the world? And zombies are attacking, and at nightfall, the whole thing's going to blow up. Then can I sleep with her?
And your answer is?
Yes! What if they're criminals? And what if this is Mother Teresa? No, they're just all normal people. They're normal people. Would you pull the lever? Yes, most people would. Now, there's another image, and it pushes it a little bit further because you're just pulling a lever. What's actually killing this person is the trolley, and you're kind of isolated from the actual event. You're just pulling a lever. But how about this one? How about, same thing, there's a trolley coming, and there's people on the track, but instead of just another person over here, there's a giant man, a large man standing right next to you. Would you push him to stop the trolley? And see, this is where the experiment is really fascinating, because almost 90% of people would pull the lever for the trolley to go the other way. But a lot less people would push the guy. Because that's actually you doing it.
Active instead of passive.
Yeah. Would you push the guy?
Same thing, isn't it?
It is kind of the same thing, but it's harder because you're actually making the contact to do it. It's kind of a cool idea. But that is basically the trolley tied to utilitarianism. And so what these are images of that philosophical framework, just to give you an idea of what does this look like when you press this out? What does this look like in real life? If you're seeking the greater good for the greatest number of people, and that's what you're concerned with, then this is what that looks like. Then you would push the guy on the track because he's going to save 5 people. And it's just one individual. But again, this has been used and abused a lot by governments who rally up large groups of people to suppress smaller groups of people. This has been used in like stadium fights. This has been used to torture people, where a large group of students don't like this one individual, or they think this individual did something bad, and they end up torturing them because it brings them joy. And they're the larger group. It's been used and abused over and over and over again. But there is some merit to it. It's just, as human beings, we can easily destroy this. Those are the 4 concepts that I had for you today. I feel like it's backloaded, this series, because the ones I have next week are they're like my favorite concept. I think I saved them for the last one. But it should be fun next week. That wraps it up. Any questions on the trolley or any other thing?
Another example would be, what if you are the large man, would you jump on the track?
I have a need to preserve myself.
About 5 or 6 other people?
I mean, it's the same thing. Like if you told me that I had to do this to live, and it was like to torture myself in some way, just kill me, because I can't do it. I can't. So I know that I would fail. So would I want to jump on the track and be the bigger person? Yeah. But would I rather push you?
You're out.
Yeah, you don't have a chance.
Yeah.
No,
don't you feel that law enforcement is having to make these type of decisions
Yeah.
Oh,
all the time?
Here's my criminal justice degree
It's your opportunity.
coming in. Yeah. This bleeds into criminal justice quite a bit because oftentimes they're forced into that. And what they often see is that when large groups suppress smaller groups, the idea behind it is oftentimes this. So when kids are bullied, it's oftentimes these larger groups of people that feed off one another, and they find great joy in the misery of another individual. And this is why I brought up there has to be an account for the level of suffering as opposed to the level of joy that is being received. You have to take that into account, which oftentimes utilitarianism does not take that into account. But that has to be taken into, if you're making decisions for the greater good of the greatest number of people, well, what benefit are they getting, and what is the suffering that the smaller group is getting? That has to be factored in. Yeah.
but suffering and joy have two different, you can't balance them together because we're dealing with this right now with all the anti-Israel, anti-Jew thinking that's going on. I mean, we obviously are so against the suffering that is happening. I could care less about the joy that the other side is receiving by, persecuting that other group. So there is no equivalent. You cannot say it's okay for more people to have enjoyment over fewer people who are suffering. The people who are suffering should get more weight.
Yeah, and that's the same thing that I'm bringing up, is that those things have to be factored in. So a lot of times it's not factored in. But any other thoughts, ideas? All right. We are good to go to church. This is the end, and I will see you next week for another fun 4. I really wouldn't push you on the track, Jack.